Chapter 12. Liking life on my own account no better, I form a great resolution. In due time, Mr. McCowber's petition was ripe for hearing, and that gentleman was ordered to be discharged under the act, to my great joy. His creditors were not implacable, and Mrs. McCowber informed me that even the revengeful bootmaker had declared in open court that he bore him no malice, but that when money was owing to him, he liked to be paid. He said he thought it was human nature. Mr. McCowber returned to the King's Bench when his case was over, as some fees were to be settled, and some formalities observed before he could be actually released. The club received him with transport and held an harmonic meeting that evening in his honor, while Mrs. McCowber and I had a lamb's fry in private, surrounded by the sleeping family. On such an occasion I will give you, Master Copperfield, said Mrs. McCowber, in a little more flip, for we had been having some already, the memory of my papa and mamma. Are they dead, ma'am? I inquired, after drinking the toast in a wine-glass. My mamma departed this life, said Mrs. McCowber, before Mr. McCowber's difficulties commenced, or at least before they became pressing. My papa lived to bail Mr. McCowber several times, and then expired, regretted by a numerous circle. Mrs. McCowber shook her head and dropped a pious tear upon the twin who happened to be in hand. As I could hardly hope for a more favorable opportunity of putting a question in which I had a near interest, I said to Mrs. McCowber, "May I ask, ma'am, what you and Mr. McCowber intend to do, now that Mr. McCowber is out of his difficulties and at liberty? Have you settled yet?" "My family," said Mrs. McCowber, who always said those two words with an air, though I never could discover who came under the denomination, "my family are of opinion that Mr. McCowber should quit London and exert his talents in the country. Mr. McCowber is a man of great talent, Master Copperfield." I said I was sure of that. "Of great talent," repeated Mrs. McCowber. "My family are of opinion that, with a little interest, something might be done for a man of his ability in the custom house. The influence of my family being local, it is their wish that Mr. McCowber should go down to Plymouth. They think it indispensable that he should be upon the spot, that he may be ready," I suggested. "Exactly," returned Mrs. McCowber, "that he may be ready, in case of anything turning up. And do you go too, ma'am?" The events of the day, in combination with the twins, if not with the flip, had made Mrs. McCowber hysterical, and she shed tears as she replied, "I never will desert Mr. McCowber. Mr. McCowber may have concealed his difficulties from me in the first instance, but his sanguine temper may have led him to expect that he would overcome them. The pearl necklace and bracelets which I inherited from Mamma have been disposed of for less than half their value, and the set of coral, which was the wedding gift of my papa, has been actually thrown away for nothing. But I never will desert Mr. McCowber." "No," cried Mrs. McCowber, more affected than before, "I never will do it. It's of no use asking me." I felt quite uncomfortable, as if Mrs. McCowber supposed I had asked her to do anything of the sort, and sat looking at her in alarm. "Mr. McCowber has his faults. I do not deny that he is improvident. I do not deny that he has kept me in the dark as to his resources and his liabilities both," she went on, looking at the wall. "But I never will desert Mr. McCowber." Mrs. McCowber having now raised her voice into a perfect scream, I was so frightened that I ran off to the clubroom and disturbed Mr. McCowber in the act of presiding at a long table and leading the chorus of "Gee up, Dobbin, gee ho, Dobbin, gee up, Dobbin, gee up, and gee ho, oh." With the tidings that Mrs. McCowber was in an alarming state, upon which he immediately burst into tears and came away with me with his waistcoat full of the heads and tails of shrimps, of which he had been partaking. "Emma, my angel," cried Mr. McCowber, running into the room, "what is the matter?" "I never will desert you, McCowber," she exclaimed. "My life," said Mr. McCowber, taking her in his arms. "I am perfectly aware of it. He is the parent of my children. He is the father of my twins. He is the husband of my affections," cried Mrs. McCowber, struggling. "And I never will desert Mr. McCowber." Mr. McCowber was so deeply affected by this proof of her devotion. As to me, I was dissolved in tears, that he hung over her in a passionate manner, imploring her to look up and to be calm. But the more he asked Mrs. McCowber to look up, the more she fixed her eyes on nothing, and the more he asked her to compose herself, the more she wouldn't. Consequently, Mr. Micawber was soon so overcome that he mingled his tears with hers and mine, until he begged me to do him the favor of taking a chair on the staircase while he got her into bed. I would have taken my leave for the night, but he would not hear of my doing that until the stranger's bell should ring. So I sat at the staircase window until he came out with another chair and joined me. "How was Mrs. Micawber now, sir?" I said. "Very low," said Mr. Micawber, shaking his head. "Reaction. Ah, this has been a dreadful day. We stand alone now. Everything is gone from us." Mr. Micawber pressed my hand and groaned, and afterwards shed tears. I was greatly touched and disappointed too, for I had expected that we should be quite gay on this happy and long-looked-for occasion. But Mr. and Mrs. Micawber were so used to their old difficulties, I think, that they felt quite shipwrecked when they came to consider that they were released from them. All their elasticity was departed, and I never saw them half so wretched as on this night, insomuch that when the bell rang, and Mr. Micawber walked with me to the lodge, and parted from me there with a blessing, I felt quite afraid to leave him by himself. He was so profoundly miserable. But through all the confusion and lowness of spirits in which we had been, so unexpectedly to me, involved, I plainly discerned that Mr. and Mrs. Micawber and their family were going away from London, and that a parting between us was near at hand. It was in my walk home that night, and in the sleepless hours which followed when I lay in bed, that the thought first occurred to me, though I don't know how it came into my head, which afterwards shaped itself into a settled resolution. I had grown to be so accustomed to the Micawbers, and had been so intimate with them in their distresses, and was so utterly friendless without them, that the prospect of being thrown upon some new shift for a lodging, and going once more among unknown people, was like being that moment turned adrift into my present life, with such a knowledge of it ready-made as experience had given me. All the sensitive feelings it wounded so cruelly, all the shame and misery it kept alive within my breast, became more poignant as I thought of this, and I determined that the life was unendurable, that there was no hope of escape from it, unless the escape was my own act. I knew quite well. I rarely heard from Miss Murdstone, and never from Mr. Murdstone, but 2 or 3 parcels of made or mended clothes had come up for me, consigned to Mr. Quinion, and in each there was a scrap of paper to the effect that J.M., trusted D.C., was applying himself to business, and devoting himself wholly to his duties. Not the least hint of my ever being anything else than the common drudge into which I was fast settling down. The very next day showed me, while my mind was in the first agitation of what it had conceived, that Mrs. Micawber had not spoken of their going away without warrant. They took a lodging in the house where I lived for a week, at the expiration of which time they were to start for Plymouth. Mr. Micawber himself came down to the counting-house in the afternoon to tell Mr. Quinion that he must relinquish me on the day of his departure, and to give me a high character, which I am sure I deserved. And Mr. Quinion, calling in Tip the Carman, who was a married man, and had a room to let, quartered me prospectively on him, by our mutual consent, as he had every reason to think, for I said nothing, though my resolution was now taken. I passed my evenings with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber during the remaining term of our residence under the same roof, and I think we became fonder of one another as the time went on. On the last Sunday, they invited me to dinner, and we had a loin of pork and apple sauce and a pudding. I had bought a spotted wooden horse overnight as a parting gift to little Wilkins Micawber. That was the boy, and a doll for little Emma. I had also bestowed a shilling on the Orpheling, who was about to be disbanded. We had a very pleasant day, though we were all in a tender state about our approaching separation. "I shall never, Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, "revert to the period when Mr. Micawber was in difficulties without thinking of you. Your conduct has always been of the most delicate and obliging description. You have never been a lodger. You have been a friend." "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, "Copperfield," for so he had been accustomed to call me of late, "has a heart to feel for the distresses of his fellow creatures when they are behind a cloud, and a head to plan, and a hand to, in short, a general ability to dispose of such available property as could be made away with. I expressed my sense of this commendation and said I was very sorry we were going to lose one another. "My dear young friend," said Mr. McCowber, "I am older than you, a man of some experience in life, and of some experience, in short, in difficulties, generally speaking. At present, and until something turns up, which I may say, hourly expecting, I have nothing to bestow but advice. Still, my advice is so far worth taking, that, in short, that I have never taken it myself, and am here Mr. McCowber, who had been beaming and smiling all over his head and face, up to the present moment, checked himself and frowned. "The miserable wretch you behold." "My dear McCowber," urged his wife. "I say," returned Mr. McCowber, quite forgetting himself, and smiling again, "the miserable wretch you behold. My advice is, never do tomorrow what you can do today. Procrastination is the thief of time. Collar him." "My poor papa's maxim," Mrs. McCowber observed. "My dear," said Mr. McCowber, "your papa was very well in his way, and heaven forbid that I should disparage him. Take him for all in all, we ne'er shall, in short, make the acquaintance, probably, of anybody else possessing, at his time of life, the same legs for gaiters, and able to read the same description of print, without spectacles. But he applied that maxim to our marriage, my dear, and that was so far prematurely entered into, in consequence, that I never recovered the expense." Mr. McCowber looked aside at Mrs. McCowber, and added, "Not that I am sorry for it. Quite the contrary, my love." After which, he was grave for a minute or so. "My other piece of advice, Copperfield," said Mr. McCowber, "you know. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, 1919 and 6. Result happiness. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £20 ought and 6. Result misery. The blossom is blighted. The leaf is withered. The god of day goes down upon the dreary scene. And in short, you are forever floored. As I am." To make his example the more impressive, Mr. McCowber drank a glass of punch with an air of great enjoyment and satisfaction, and whistled the college hornpipe. I did not fail to assure him that I would store these precepts in my mind, though indeed I had no need to do so, for at the time they affected me visibly. Next morning I met the whole family at the coach office, and saw them, with a desolate heart, take their places outside, at the back. "Master Copperfield," said Mrs. McCowber, "God bless you. I never can forget all that, you know, and I never would if I could." "Copperfield," said Mr. McCowber, "farewell. Every happiness and prosperity. If, in the progress of revolving years, I could persuade myself that my blighted destiny had been a warning to you, I should feel that I had not occupied another man's place in existence altogether in vain. In case of anything turning up, of which I am rather confident, I shall be extremely happy if it should be in my power to improve your prospects." I think, as Mrs. McCowber sat at the back of the coach with the children, and I stood in the road looking wistfully at them, a mist cleared from her eyes, and she saw what a little creature I really was. I think so, because she beckoned to me to climb up with quite a new and motherly expression in her face, and put her arm round my neck, and gave me just such a kiss as she might have given to her own boy. I had barely time to get down again before the coach started, and I could hardly see the family for the handkerchiefs they waved. It was gone in a minute. The orpheling and I stood looking vacantly at each other in the middle of the road, and then shook hands and said good-bye. She going back, I suppose, to St. Luke's workhouse, as I went to begin my weary day at Murdstone and Grimby's, but with no intention of passing many more weary days there. No, I had resolved to run away, to go by some means or other down into the country to the only relation I had in the world, and tell my story to my aunt, Miss Betsy. I have already observed that I don't know how this desperate idea came into my brain, but once there, it remained there, and hardened into a purpose than which I have never entertained a more determined purpose in my life. I am far from sure that I believed there was anything hopeful in it, but my mind was thoroughly made up that it must be carried into execution. Again and again, and 100 times again, since the night when the thought had first occurred to me and banished sleep, I had gone over that old story of my poor mother's about my birth, which it had been one of my great delights in the old time to hear her tell, and which I knew by heart. My aunt walked into that story and walked out of it, a dread and awful personage. But there was one little trait in her behavior which I liked to dwell on, and which gave me some faint shadow of encouragement. I could not forget how my mother had thought that she felt her touch her pretty hair with no ungentle hand. And though it might have been altogether my mother's fancy, and might have had no foundation whatever in fact, I made a little picture out of it of my terrible aunt relenting towards the girlish beauty that I recollected so well and loved so much, which softened the whole narrative. It is very possible that it had been in my mind a long time and had gradually engendered my determination. As I did not even know where Miss Betsy lived, I wrote a long letter to Peggotty and asked her, incidentally, if she remembered, pretending that I had heard of such a lady living at a certain place I named at random, and had a curiosity to know if it were the same. In the course of that letter, I told Peggotty that I had a particular occasion for half a guinea, and that if she could lend me that sum until I could repay it, I should be very much obliged to her, and would tell her afterwards what I had wanted it for. Peggotty's answer soon arrived, and was, as usual, full of affectionate devotion. She enclosed the half-guinea. I was afraid she must have had a world of trouble to get it out of Mr. Burkiss's box, and told me that Miss Betsy lived near Dover, but whether at Dover itself, at Hythe, Sandgate, or Folkestone, she could not say. One of our men, however, informing me on my asking him about these places, that they were all close together, I deemed this enough for my object, and resolved to set out at the end of that week. Being a very honest little creature, and unwilling to disgrace the memory I was going to leave behind me at Murdstone and Grinby's, I considered myself bound to remain until Saturday night, and, as I had been paid a week's wages in advance when I first came there, not to present myself in the counting-house at the usual hour to receive my stipend. For this express reason, I had borrowed the half-guinea, that I might not be without a fund for my traveling expenses. Accordingly, when the Saturday night came, and we were all waiting in the warehouse to be paid, and Tip the carman, who always took precedence, went in first to draw his money, I shook Mick Walker by the hand, asked him, when it came to his turn to be paid, to say to Mr. Quinion that I had gone to move my box to Tip's, and, bidding a last good night to Mealy Potatoes, ran away. My box was in my old lodging, over the water, and I had written a direction for it on the back of one of our address cards that we nailed on the casks. Master David, to be left till called for at the coach office, Dover. This I had in my pocket, ready to put on the box after I should have got out of the house. And, as I went toward my lodging, I looked about me for someone who would help me to carry it to the booking office. There was a long-legged young man with a very little empty donkey cart, standing near the obelisk in the Blackfriars Road, whose eye I caught as I was going by, and who, addressing me as sixpence north of bad ha'pence, hoped I should know him again to swear to an allusion, I have no doubt, to my staring at him. I stopped to assure him that I had not done so in bad manners, but uncertain whether he might or might not like a job. "What job?" said the long-legged young man. "To move a box," I answered. "What box?" said the long-legged young man. I told him mine, which was down that street there, and which I wanted him to take to the Dover coach office for sixpence. "Done with you for a tanner," said the long-legged young man, and directly got upon his cart, which was nothing but a large wooden tray on wheels, and rattled away at such a rate that it was as much as I could do to keep pace with the donkey. There was a defiant manner about this young man, and particularly about the way in which he chewed straw as he spoke to me, that I did not much like. As the bargain was made, however, I took him upstairs to the room I was leaving, and we brought the box down and put on his cart. Now, I was unwilling to put the direction card on there, lest any of my landlord's family should fathom what I was doing and detain me. So I said to the young man that I would be glad if he would stop for a minute, when he came to the dead wall of the King's Bench prison. The words were no sooner out of my mouth than he rattled away as if he, my box, the cart, and the donkey were all equally mad, and was quite out of breath with running and calling after him, when I caught him at the place appointed. Being much flushed and excited, I tumbled my half-guinea out of my pocket and pulling the card out. I put it in my mouth for safety, and, though my hands trembled a good deal, had just tied the card on very much to my satisfaction, when I felt myself violently chucked under the chin by the long-legged young man and saw my half-guinea fly out of my mouth into his hand. "What?" said the young man, seizing me by my jacket collar with a frightful grin. "This is a Paulus case, is it? You're going to bolt, are you? Come to the Paulus. You young warmen, come to the Paulus." "You give me my money back, if you please," said I, very much frightened, "and leave me alone." "Come to the Paulus," said the young man. "You shall prove it yourn to the Paulus." "Give me my box and money, will you?" I cried, bursting into tears. The young man still replied, "Come to the Paulus," and was dragging me against the donkey in a violent manner, as if there were any affinity between that animal and a magistrate, when he changed his mind, jumped into the cart, sat upon my box, and, exclaiming that he would drive to the Paulus straight, rattled away harder than ever. I ran after him as fast as I could, but I had no breath to call out with, and should not have dared to call out now if I had. I narrowly escaped being run over 20 times at least in half a mile. Now I lost him, now I saw him, now I lost him, now I was cut at with a whip, now shouted at, now down in the mud, now up again, now running into somebody's arms, now running headlong at a post. At length, confused by fright and heat, and doubting whether half London might not by this time be turning out for my apprehension, I left the young man to go where he would with my box and money, and, panting and crying, but never stopping, faced about for Greenwich, which I had understood was on the Dover Road, taking very little more out of the world towards the retreat of my aunt, Miss Betsy, than I had brought into it, on the night when my arrival gave her so much umbrage. Chapter 13. The sequel of my resolution. For anything I know, I may have had some wild idea of running all the way to Dover when I gave up the pursuit of the young man with the donkey cart and started for Greenwich. My scattered senses were soon collected as to that point, if I had, for I came to a stop in the Kent Road, at a terrace with a piece of water before it, and a great foolish image in the middle, blowing a dry shell. Here I sat down on a doorstep, quite spent and exhausted with the efforts I had already made, and with hardly breath enough to cry for the loss of my box and half-guinea. It was by this time dark. I heard the clock strike 10 as I sat resting. But it was a summer night, fortunately, and fine weather. When I had recovered my breath and had got rid of a stifling sensation in my throat, I rose up and went on. In the midst of my distress, I had no notion of going back. I doubt if I should have had any, though there had been a Swiss snowdrift in the Kent Road. But my standing possessed of only 3 halfpence in the world, and I am sure I wonder how they came to be left in my pocket on a Saturday night, trouble me none the less because I went on. I began to picture to myself, as a scrap of newspaper intelligence, my being found dead in a day or two under some hedge, and I trudged on miserably, though as fast as I could, until I happened to pass a little shop, where it was written up that ladies' and gentlemen's wardrobes were bought, and that the best price was given for rags, bones, and kitchen stuff. The master of the shop was sitting at the door in his shirt sleeves, smoking, and as there were a great many coats and pairs of trousers dangling from the low ceiling, and only 2 feeble candles burning inside to show what they were, I fancied that he looked like a man of a revengeful disposition, who had hung all his enemies, and was enjoying himself. My late experiences with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber suggested to me that here might be a means of keeping off the wolf for a little while. I went up the next by-street, took off my waistcoat, rolled it neatly under my arm, and came back to the shop door. "If you please, sir," I said, "I am to sell this for a fair price." Mr. Dollaby was the name over the shop door, at least, took the waistcoat, stood his pipe on its head against the doorpost, went into the shop, followed by me, snuffed the 2 candles with his fingers, spread the waistcoat on the counter, and looked at it there, held it up against the light, and looked at it there, and ultimately said, "What do you call a price now for this here little waistcoat?" "Oh, you know best, sir," I returned modestly. "I can't be buyer and seller too," said Mr. Dollaby. "Put a price on this here little waistcoat. Would 18 pence be?" I hinted, after some hesitation. Mr. Dollaby rolled it up again and gave it me back. "I should rob my family," he said, "if I was to offer 9 pence for it." This was a disagreeable way of putting the business, because it imposed upon me, a perfect stranger, the unpleasantness of asking Mr. Dollaby to rob his family on my account. My circumstances being so very pressing. However, I said I would take 9 pence for it, if he pleased. Mr. Dollaby, not without some grumbling, gave 9 pence. I wished him good night, and walked out of the shop the richer by that sum, and the poorer by a waistcoat. But when I buttoned my jacket, that was not much. Indeed, I foresaw pretty clearly that my jacket would go next, and that I should have to make the best of my way to Dover in a shirt and a pair of trousers, and might deem myself lucky if I got there even in that trim. But my mind had not run so much on this as might be supposed. Beyond a general impression of the distance before me, and of the young man with the donkey cart having used me cruelly, I think I had no very urgent sense of my difficulties when I once again set off with my 9 pence in my pocket. A plan had occurred to me for passing the night, which I was going to carry into execution. This was to lie behind the wall at the back of my old school, in a corner where there used to be a haystack. I imagined it would be a kind of company to have the boys, and the bedroom where I used to tell the stories, so near me, although the boys would know nothing of my being there, and the bedroom would yield me no shelter. I had had a hard day's work, and was pretty well jaded when I came climbing out, at last, upon the level of Blackheath. It cost me some trouble to find out Salem House, but I found it, and I found a haystack in the corner, and I lay down by it, having first walked round the wall, and looked up at the windows, and seen that all was dark and silent within. Never shall I forget the lonely sensation of first lying down, without a roof above my head. Sleep came upon me, as it came on many other outcasts, against whom house doors were locked and house dogs barked, that night, and I dreamed of lying on my old school bed, talking to the boys in my room, and found myself sitting upright, with Steerforth's name upon my lips, looking wildly at the stars that were glistening and glimmering above me. When I remembered where I was at that untimely hour, a feeling stole upon me that made me get up, afraid of I don't know what, and walk about. But the fainter glimmering of the stars, and the pale light in the sky where the day was coming, reassured me, and my eyes being very heavy, I lay down again and slept, though with the knowledge in my sleep that it was cold, until the warm beams of the sun and the ringing of the getting-up bell at Salem House awoke me. If I could have hoped that Steerforth was there, I would have lurked about until he came out alone, but I knew he must have left long since. Traddles still remained, perhaps, but it was very doubtful, and I had not sufficient confidence in his discretion or good luck, however strong my reliance was on his good nature, to wish to trust him with my situation. So I crept away from the wall as Mr. Creakle's boys were getting up, and struck into the long, dusty track which I had first known to be the Dover Road when I was one of them, and when I little expected that any eyes would ever see me the wayfarer I was now upon it. What a different Sunday morning from the old Sunday morning at Yarmouth! In due time I heard the church bells ringing as I plodded on, and I met people who were going to church, and I passed a church or two where the congregation were inside, and the sound of singing came out into the sunshine, while the beadle sat and cooled himself in the shade of the porch, or stood beneath the yew tree, with his hand to his forehead, glowering at me going by. But the peace and rest of the old Sunday morning were on everything, except me. That was the difference. I felt quite wicked in my dirt and dust with my tangled hair. But for the quiet picture I had conjured up of my mother in her youth and beauty, weeping by the fire, and my aunt relenting to her, I hardly think I should have had the courage to go on until next day. But always went before me, and I followed. I got, that Sunday, through 23 miles on the straight road, though not very easily, for I was new to that kind of toil. I see myself, as evening closes in, coming over the bridge at Rochester, footsore and tired, and eating bread that I had bought for supper. 1 or 2 little houses, with a notice, lodgings for travelers, hanging out, had tempted me, but I was afraid of spending the few pence I had, and was even more afraid of the vicious looks of the trampers I had met or overtaken. I sought no shelter, therefore, but the sky, and toiling into Chatham, which in that night's aspect is a mere dream of chalk and drawbridges, and mastless ships in a muddy river, roofed like Noah's arks, crept at last upon a sort of grass-grown battery overhanging a lane, where a sentry was walking to and fro. Here I lay down, near a cannon, and happy in the society of the sentry's footsteps, though he knew no more of my being above him than the boys at Salem House had known of my lying by the wall, slept soundly until morning. Very stiff and sore of foot I was in the morning, and quite dazed by the beating of drums and marching of troops, which seemed to hem me in on every side when I went down towards the long, narrow street, feeling that I could go but a very little way that day. If I were to reserve any strength for getting to my journey's end, I resolved to make the sale of my jacket its principal business. Accordingly, I took the jacket off, that I might learn to do without it, and carrying it under my arm, began a tour of inspection of the various slop shops. It was a likely place to sell a jacket in, for the dealers in second-hand clothes were numerous, and were, generally speaking, on the lookout for customers at their shop doors. But as most of them had, hanging up among their stock, an officer's coat or two, epaulets and all, I was rendered timid by the costly nature of their dealings, and walked about for a long time without offering my merchandise to anyone. This modesty of mine directed my attention to the marine store shops, and such shops as Mr. Dolloby's, in preference to the regular dealers. At last I found one that I thought looked promising, at the corner of a dirty lane, ending in an enclosure full of stinging nettles, against the palings of which some second-hand sailors' clothes, that seemed to have overflowed the shop, were fluttering among some cots, and rusty guns and oilskin hats, and certain trays full of so many old rusty keys of so many sizes that they seemed various enough to open all the doors in the world. Into this shop, which was low and small, and which was darkened rather than lighted by a little window, overhung with clothes, and was descended into by some steps, I went with a palpitating heart, which was not relieved when an ugly old man, with the lower part of his face all covered with a stubbly gray beard, rushed out of a dirty den behind it, and seized me by the hair of my head. He was a dreadful old man to look at, in a filthy flannel waistcoat, and smelling terribly of rum. His bedstead, covered with a tumbled and ragged piece of patchwork, was in the den he had come from, where another little window showed a prospect of more stinging nettles and a lame donkey. "Oh, what do you want?" grinned this old man, in a fierce, monotonous whine. "Oh, my eyes and limbs, what do you want? Oh, my lungs and liver, what do you want? Oh, guru." I was so much dismayed by these words, and particularly by the repetition of the last unknown one, which was a kind of rattle in his throat, that I could make no answer. Hereupon the old man, still holding me by the hair, repeated, "Oh, what do you want? Oh, my eyes and limbs, what do you want? Oh, my lungs and liver, what do you want? Oh, guru," which he screwed out of himself with an energy that made his eyes start in his head. "I want to know," I said, trembling, "if you would buy a jacket." "Oh, let's see the jacket," cried the old man. "Oh, my heart on fire, show the jacket to us. Oh, my eyes and limbs, bring the jacket out." With that he took his trembling hands, which were like the claws of a great bird, out of my hair, and put on a pair of spectacles, not at all ornamental to his inflamed eyes. "Oh, how much for the jacket?" cried the old man, after examining it. "Oh, guru, how much for the jacket?" "Half a crown," I answered, recovering myself. "Oh, my lungs and liver," cried the old man, "no. Oh, my eyes, no. Oh, my limbs, no. 18 pence. Guru." Every time he uttered this ejaculation, his eyes seemed to be in danger of starting out, and every sentence he spoke, he delivered in a sort of tune, always exactly the same, and more like a gust of wind, which begins low, mounts up high, and falls again, than any other comparison I can find for it. "Well," said I, glad to have closed the bargain, "I'll take 18 pence. "Oh, my liver," cried the old man, throwing the jacket on a shelf. "Get out of the shop." "Oh, my lungs, get out of the shop." "Oh, my eyes and limbs, guru, don't ask for money, make an exchange." I never was so frightened in my life, before or since, but I told him humbly that I wanted money, and that nothing else was of any use to me, but that I would wait for it as he desired, outside, and had no wish to hurry him. So I went outside, and sat down in the shade in a corner. And I sat there so many hours that the shade became sunlight, and the sunlight became shade again, and still I sat there waiting for the money. There never was such another drunken madman in that line of business, I hope, that he was well known in the neighborhood, and enjoyed the reputation of having sold himself to the devil. I soon understood from the visits he received from the boys, who continually came skirmishing about the shop, shouting that legend, and calling to him to bring out his gold. You ain't poor, you know, Charlie, as you pretend. Bring out your gold. Bring out some of the gold you sold yourself to the devil for. Come, it's an aligning of the mattress, Charlie. Rip it open and let's have some. This, and many offers to lend him a knife for the purpose, exasperated him to such a degree that the whole day was a succession of rushes on his part and flights on the part of the boys. Sometimes in his rage he would take me for one of them and come at me, mouthing as if he were going to tear me in pieces. Then, remembering me, just in time, would dive into the shop and lie upon his bed, as I thought from the sound of his voice, yelling in a frantic way to his own windy tune, "The Death of Nelson," with an O, before every line, and innumerable gurus interspersed. As if this were not bad enough for me, the boys, connecting me with the establishment, on account of the patience and perseverance with which I sat outside, half-dressed, pelted me, and used me very ill all day. He made many attempts to induce me to consent to an exchange, at one time coming out with a fishing rod, at another with a fiddle, at another with a cocked hat, at another with a flute. But I resisted all these overtures, and sat there in desperation, each time asking him, with tears in my eyes, for my money or my jacket. At last he began to pay me in halfpence at a time, and was full 2 hours getting by easy stages to a shilling. "Oh, my eyes and limbs," he then cried, peeping hideously out of the shop, after a long pause. "Will you go for 2pence more?" "I can't," I said. "I shall be starved." "Oh, my lungs and liver, will you go for 3pence?" "I would go for nothing if I could," I said, "but I want the money badly." "Oh, go roo." It is really impossible to express how he twisted this ejaculation out of himself, as he peeped round the doorpost at me, showing nothing but his crafty old head. "Will you go for 4pence?" I was so faint and weary that I closed with this offer, and taking the money out of his claw, not without trembling, went away more hungry and thirsty than I had ever been, a little before sunset. But at an expense of 3pence, I soon refreshed myself completely, and, being in better spirits then, limped 7 miles upon my road. My bed at night was under another haystack, where I rested comfortably after having washed my blistered feet in a stream and dressed them as well as I was able with some cool leaves. When I took the road again next morning, I found that it lay through a succession of hop grounds and orchards. It was sufficiently late in the year for the orchards to be ruddy with ripe apples, and in a few places the hop pickers were already at work. I thought it all extremely beautiful, and made up my mind to sleep among the hops that night, imagining some cheerful companionship in the long perspectives of poles, with the graceful leaves twining round them. The trampers were worse than ever that day, and inspired me with a dread that is yet quite fresh in my mind. Some of them were most ferocious-looking ruffians who stared at me as I went by, and stopped, perhaps, and called after me to come back and speak to them, and when I took to my heels, stoned me. I recollect one young fellow, a tinker, I suppose, from his wallet and brazier, who had a woman with him, and who faced about and stared at me thus, and then roared to me in such a tremendous voice to come back, that I halted and looked round. "Come here, when you're called," said the tinker, "or I'll rip your young body open." I thought best to go back. As I drew nearer to them, trying to propitiate the tinker by my looks, I observed that the woman had a black eye. "Where are you going?" said the tinker, gripping the bosom of my shirt with his blackened hand. "I'm going to Dover," I said. "Where do you come from?" asked the tinker, giving his hand another turn of my shirt, to hold me more securely. "I come from London," I said. "What lay are you upon?" asked the tinker. "Are you a prig?" "And no," I said. "Ain't you, by G?" "If you make a brag of your honesty to me," said the tinker, "I'll knock your brains out." With his disengaged hand, he made a menace of striking me, and then looked at me from head to foot. "Have you got the price of a pint of beer about you?" said the tinker. "If you have, out with it, afore I take it away." I should certainly have produced it, but that I met the woman's look, and saw her very slightly shake her head, and form no, with her lips. "I am very poor," I said, attempting to smile, "and have got no money." "Why, what do you mean?" said the tinker, looking so sternly at me that I almost feared he saw the money in my pocket. Sir, I stammered. What do you mean, said the tinker, by wearing my brother's silk handkerchief? Give it over here. And he had mine off my neck in a moment and tossed it to the woman. The woman burst into a fit of laughter, as if she thought this a joke, and tossed it back to me, nodded once, as slightly as before, and made the word go with her lips. Before I could obey, however, the tinker seized the handkerchief out of my hand with a roughness that threw me away like a feather, and putting it loosely round his own neck, turned upon the woman with an oath and knocked her down. I never shall forget seeing her fall backward on the hard road, and lie there with her bonnet tumbled off, and her hair all whitened in the dust. Nor, when I looked back from a distance, seeing her sitting on the pathway, which was a bank by the roadside, wiping the blood from her face with a corner of her shawl, while he went on ahead. This adventure frightened me so that, afterwards, when I saw any of these people coming, I turned back until I could find a hiding place, where I remained until they had gone out of sight, which happened so often that I was very seriously delayed. But under this difficulty, as under all the other difficulties of my journey, I seemed to be sustained and led on by my fanciful picture of my mother in her youth, before I came into the world. It always kept me company. It was there among the hops when I lay down to sleep. It was with me on my waking in the morning. It went before me all day. I have associated it, ever since, with the sunny street of Canterbury, dozing as it were in the hot light, and with the sight of its old houses and gateways, and the stately, gray cathedral, with the rooks sailing round the towers. When I came at last upon the bare, wide downs near Dover, it relieved the solitary aspect of the scene with hope, and not until I reached that first great aim of my journey, and actually set foot in the town itself on the 6th day of my flight, did it desert me. But then, strange to say, when I stood with my ragged shoes and my dusty, sunburnt, half-clothed figure in the place so long desired, it seemed to vanish like a dream, and to leave me helpless and dispirited. I inquired about my aunt among the boatmen first, and received various answers. One said she lived in the South Foreland Light, and had singed her whiskers by doing so. Another, that she was made fast to the great buoy outside the harbor, and could only be visited at half-tide. A third, that she was locked up in Maidstone jail for child stealing. A fourth, that she was seen to mount a broom in the last high wind, and make direct for Calais. The fly drivers, among whom I inquired next, were equally jocose and equally disrespectful, and the shopkeepers, not liking my appearance, generally replied, without hearing what I had to say, that they had got nothing for me. I felt more miserable and destitute than I had done at any period of my running away. My money was all gone. I had nothing left to dispose of. I was hungry, thirsty, and worn out, and seemed as distant from my end as if I had remained in London. The morning had worn away in these inquiries, and I was sitting on the step of an empty shop at a street corner, near the marketplace, deliberating upon wandering towards those other places which have been mentioned, when a fly driver, coming by with his carriage, dropped a horsecloth. Something good-natured in the man's face, as I handed it up, encouraged me to ask him if he could tell me where Miss Trotwood lived, though I had asked the question so often that it almost died upon my lips. "Trotwood," said he. "Let me see. I know the name, too. Old lady." "Yes," I said, "rather." "Pretty stiff in the back," said he, making himself upright. "Yes," I said, "I should think it very likely." "Carries a bag," said he, "bag with a good deal of room in it. Is gruffish, and comes down upon you sharp." My heart sank within me as I acknowledged the undoubted accuracy of this description. "Why then, I tell you what," said he, "if you go up there, pointing with his whip towards the heights, and keep right on till you come to some houses facing the sea, I think you'll hear of her. My opinion is she won't stand anything, so here's a penny for you." I accepted the gift thankfully and bought a loaf with it. Dispatching this refreshment by the way, I went in the direction my friend had indicated and walked on a good distance without coming to the houses he had mentioned. At length I saw some before me, and approaching them, went into a little shop. It was what we used to call a general shop at home, and inquired if they could have the goodness to tell me where Miss Trotwood lived. I addressed myself to a man behind the counter, who was weighing some rice for a young woman. But the latter, taking the inquiry to herself, turned round quickly. "My mistress," she said. "What do you want with her, boy?" "I want," I replied, "to speak to her, if you please." "To beg of her, you mean?" retorted the damsel. "No," I said, "indeed." But suddenly remembering that in truth I came for no other purpose, I held my peace in confusion and felt my face burn. My aunt's handmaid, as I suppose she was from what she had said, put her rice in a little basket and walked out of the shop, telling me that I could follow her if I wanted to know where Miss Trotwood lived. I needed no second permission, though I was by this time in such a state of consternation and agitation that my legs shook under me. I followed the young woman, and we soon came to a very neat little cottage with cheerful bow windows. In front of it, a small square gravelled court or garden full of flowers, carefully tended and smelling deliciously. "This is Miss Trotwood's," said the young woman. "Now you know, and that's all I have got to say." With which words she hurried into the house, as if to shake off the responsibility of my appearance, and left me standing at the garden gate, looking disconsolately over the top of it towards the parlor window, where a muslin curtain partly undrawn in the middle, a large round green screen or fan fastened on to the window-sill, a small table, and a great chair suggested to me that my aunt might be at that moment seated in awful state. My shoes were by this time in a woeful condition. The soles had shed themselves bit by bit, and the upper leathers had broken and burst until the very shape and form of shoes had departed from them. My hat, which had served me for a nightcap, too, was so crushed and bent that no old battered handleless saucepan on a dunghill need have been ashamed to vie with it. My shirt and trousers, stained with heat, dew, grass, and the kindish soil on which I had slept, and torn besides, might have frightened the birds from my aunt's garden as I stood at the gate. My hair had known no comb or brush since I left London. My face, neck, and hands, from unaccustomed exposure to the air and sun, were burnt to a berry brown. From head to foot, I was powdered almost as white with chalk and dust as if I had come out of a lime kiln. In this plight, and with a strong consciousness of it, I waited to introduce myself to and make my first impression on my formidable aunt. The unbroken stillness of the parlor window leading me to infer, after a while, that she was not there, I lifted up my eyes to the window above it, where I saw a florid, pleasant-looking gentleman with a gray head, who shut up one eye in a grotesque manner, nodded his head at me several times, shook it at me as often, laughed, and went away. I had been discomposed enough before, but I was so much the more discomposed by this unexpected behavior that I was on the point of slinking off to think how I had best proceed, when there came out of the house a lady with her handkerchief tied over her cap and a pair of gardening gloves on her hands, wearing a gardening pocket like a tollman's apron and carrying a great knife. I knew her immediately to be Miss Betsy, for she came stalking out of the house exactly as my poor mother had so often described her stalking up our garden at Blunderstone Rookery. "Go away," said Miss Betsy, shaking her head and making a distant chop in the air with her knife. "Go along. No boys here." I watched her, with my heart at my lips, as she marched to a corner of her garden and stooped to dig up some little root there. Then, without a scrap of courage, but with a great deal of desperation, I went softly in and stood beside her, touching her with my finger. "If you please, ma'am," I began. She started and looked up. "If you please, Aunt." "Yach!" exclaimed Miss Betsy, in a tone of amazement I have never heard approached. "If you please, Aunt, I am your nephew." "Oh, Lord," said my aunt, and sat flat down in the garden path. "I am David Copperfield of Blunderstone in Suffolk, where you came on the night when I was born and saw my dear mamma. I have been very unhappy since she died. I have been slighted and taught nothing and thrown upon myself and put to work not fit for me. It made me run away to you. I was robbed at first setting out, and have walked all the way and have never slept in a bed since I began the journey." Here my self-support gave way all at once, and with a movement of my hands, intended to show her my ragged state and call it to witness that I had suffered something, I broke into a passion of crying, which I suppose had been pent up within me all the week. My aunt, with every sort of expression but wonder discharged from her countenance, sat on the gravel, staring at me, until I began to cry, when she got up in a great hurry, collared me, and took me into the parlor. Her first proceeding there was to unlock a tall press, bring out several bottles, and pour some of the contents of each into my mouth. I think they must have been taken out at random, for I am sure I tasted aniseed water, anchovy sauce, and salad dressing. When she had administered these restoratives, as I was still quite hysterical and unable to control my sobs, she put me on the sofa, with a shawl under my head and the handkerchief from her own head under my feet, lest I should sully the cover. And then, sitting herself down behind the green fan or screen I have already mentioned so that I could not see her face, ejaculated at intervals, "Mercy on us!" letting those exclamations off like minute guns. After a time, she rang the bell. "Janet," said my aunt, when her servant came in, "go upstairs, give my compliments to Mr. Dick, and say I wish to speak to him." Janet looked a little surprised to see me lying stiffly on the sofa. I was afraid to move, lest it should be displeasing to my aunt, but went on her errand. My aunt, with her hands behind her, walked up and down the room, until the gentleman who had squinted at me from the upper window came in laughing. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "don't be a fool, because nobody can be more discreet than you can when you choose. We all know that. So don't be a fool, whatever you are." The gentleman was serious immediately, and looked at me, I thought, as if he would entreat me to say nothing about the window. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "you have heard me mention David Copperfield? Now don't pretend not to have a memory, because you and I know better." "David Copperfield," said Mr. Dick, who did not appear to me to remember much about it. "David Copperfield? Oh, yes, to be sure. David, certainly." "Well," said my aunt, "this is his boy, his son. He would be as like his father as it's possible to be, if he was not so like his mother, too." "His son?" said Mr. Dick. "David's son? Indeed." "Yes," pursued my aunt, "and he has done a pretty piece of business. He has run away." "Ah, his sister, Betsy Trotwood, never would have run away." My aunt shook her head firmly, confident in the character and behavior of the girl who never was born. "Oh, you think she wouldn't have run away?" said Mr. Dick. "Bless and save the man," exclaimed my aunt sharply. "How he talks! Don't I know she wouldn't? She would have lived with her godmother, and we should have been devoted to one another. Where, in the name of wonder, should his sister, Betsy Trotwood, have run from, or to—" "Nowhere," said Mr. Dick. "Well, then," returned my aunt, softened by the reply, "how can you pretend to be wool-gathering, Dick, when you are as sharp as a surgeon's lancet? Now, here you see young David Copperfield, and the question I put to you is, what shall I do with him?" "What shall you do with him?" said Mr. Dick, feebly, scratching his head. "Oh, do with him? Yes," said my aunt, with a grave look, and her forefinger held up. "Come, I want some very sound advice." "Why, if I was you," said Mr. Dick, considering and looking vacantly at me, "I should—" The contemplation of me seemed to inspire him with a sudden idea, and he added, briskly, "I should wash him." "Janet," said my aunt, turning round with a quiet triumph, which I did not then understand, "Mr. Dick sets us all right. Heat the bath." Although I was deeply interested in this dialogue, I could not help observing my aunt, Mr. Dick, and Janet, while it was in progress, and completing a survey I had already been engaged in making of the room. My aunt was a tall, hard-featured lady, but by no means ill-looking. There was an inflexibility in her face, in her voice, in her gait and carriage, amply sufficient to account for the effect she had made upon a gentle creature like my mother. But her features were rather handsome than otherwise, though unbending and austere. I particularly noticed that she had a very quick, bright eye. Her hair, which was gray, was arranged in two plain divisions, under what I believe would be called a mob cap. I mean a cap, much more common then than now, with side pieces fastening under the chin. Her dress was of a lavender color, and perfectly neat, but scantily made, as if she desired to be as little encumbered as possible. I remember that I thought it, in form, more like a riding habit with the superfluous skirt cut off than anything else. She wore at her side a gentleman's gold watch, if I might judge from its size and make, with an appropriate chain and seals, She had some linen at her throat, not unlike a shirt collar, and things at her wrists like little shirt wristbands. Mr. Dick, as I've already said, was gray-headed and florid. I should have said all about him, in saying so, had not his head been curiously bowed. Not by age. It reminded me of one of Mr. Creakle's boys' heads after a beating, and his gray eyes prominent and large, with a strange kind of watery brightness in them that made me, in combination with his vacant manner, his submission to my aunt, and his childish delight when she praised him, suspect him of being a little mad, though, if he were mad, how he came to be there puzzled me extremely. He was dressed like any other ordinary gentleman, in a loose gray morning coat and waistcoat and white trousers, and had his watch in his fob and his money in his pockets, which he rattled as if he were very proud of it. Janet was a pretty blooming girl of about 19 or 20 and a perfect picture of neatness. Though I made no further observation of her at the moment, I may mention here what I did not discover until afterwards, namely, that she was one of a series of protégés whom my aunt had taken into her service expressly to educate in a renouncement of mankind, and who had generally completed their abjuration by marrying the baker. The room was as neat as Janet or my aunt. As I laid down my pen, a moment since, to think of it, the air from the sea came blowing in again, mixed with the perfume of the flowers, and I saw the old-fashioned furniture brightly rubbed and polished, my aunt's inviolable chair and table by the round green fan in the bow window, the drugget-covered carpet, the cat, the kettle holder, the two canaries, the old china, the punch bowl full of dried rose leaves, the tall press guarding all sorts of bottles and pots, and, wonderfully out of keeping with the rest, my dusty self upon the sofa, taking note of everything. Janet had gone away to get the bath ready, when my aunt, to my great alarm, became in one moment rigid with indignation, and had hardly voice to cry out, "Janet, donkeys!" Upon which, Janet came running up the stairs as if the house were in flames, darted out on a little piece of green in front, and warned off 2 saddle donkeys, lady-ridden, that had presumed to set hoof upon it, while my aunt, rushing out of the house, seized the bridle of a 3rd animal laden with a bestriding child, turned him, led him forth from those sacred precincts, and boxed the ears of the unlucky urchin in attendance who had dared to profane that hallowed ground. To this hour, I don't know whether my aunt had any lawful right-of-way over that patch of green, but she had settled it in her own mind that she had, and it was all the same to her. The one great outrage of her life, demanding to be constantly avenged, was the passage of a donkey over that immaculate spot. In whatever occupation she was engaged, however interesting to her the conversation in which she was taking part, a donkey turned the current of her ideas in a moment, and she was upon him straight. Jugs of water and watering pots were kept in secret places ready to be discharged on the offending boys. Sticks were laid in ambush behind the door. Sallies were made at all hours. An incessant war prevailed. Perhaps this was an agreeable excitement to the donkey boys, or perhaps the more sagacious of the donkeys, understanding how the case stood, delighted with constitutional obstinacy in coming that way. I only know that there were 3 alarms before the bath was ready, and that on the occasion of the last and most desperate of all, I saw my aunt engage, single-handed, with a sandy-headed lad of 15, and bump his sandy head against her own gate, before he seemed to comprehend what was the matter. These interruptions were of the more ridiculous to me, because she was giving me broth out of a tablespoon at the time, having firmly persuaded herself that I was actually starving and must receive nourishment at first in very small quantities, and, while my mouth was yet open to receive the spoon, she would put it back into the basin, cry Janet, "Donkeys!" and go out to the assault. The bath was a great comfort, for I began to be sensible of acute pains in my limbs from lying out in the fields, and was now so tired and low that I could hardly keep myself awake for 5 minutes together. When I had bathed, my aunt and Janet, enrobed me in a shirt and a pair of trousers belonging to Mr. Dick, and tied me up in 2 or 3 great shawls. What sort of bundle I looked like, I don't know, but I felt a very hot one. Feeling also very faint and drowsy, I soon lay down on the sofa again and fell asleep. It might have been a dream, originating in the fancy which had occupied my mind so long, but I awoke with the impression that my aunt had come and bent over me, and had put my hair away from my face and laid my head more comfortably, and had then stood looking at me. The words, pretty fellow, or poor fellow, seemed to be in my ears too, but certainly there was nothing else when I awoke to lead me to believe that they had been uttered by my aunt, who sat in the bow window gazing at the sea from behind the green fan, which was mounted on a kind of swivel, and turned anyway. We dined soon after I awoke, off a roast fowl and a pudding, I sitting at table, not unlike a trussed bird myself, and moving my arms with considerable difficulty. But as my aunt had swathed me up, I made no complaint of being inconvenienced. All this time, I was deeply anxious to know what she was going to do with me. But she took her dinner in profound silence, except when she occasionally fixed her eyes on me sitting opposite, and said, "Mercy upon us," which did not by any means relieve my anxiety. The cloth being drawn, and some sherry put upon the table, of which I had a glass, my aunt sent up for Mr. Dick again, who joined us, and looked as wise as he could when she requested him to attend to my story, which he elicited from me, gradually, by a course of questions. During my recital, she kept her eyes on Mr. Dick, who I thought would have gone to sleep but for that, and who, whensoever he lapsed into a smile, was checked by a frown from my aunt. Whatever possessed that poor unfortunate baby, that she must go and be married again, said my aunt. When I had finished, I can't conceive. Perhaps she fell in love with her second husband, Mr. Dick suggested. Fell in love, repeated my aunt. What do you mean? What business had she to do it? Perhaps, Mr. Dick simpered, after thinking a little, she did it for pleasure. Pleasure indeed, replied my aunt. A mighty pleasure for the poor baby to fix her simple faith upon any dog of a fellow, certain to ill-use her in some way or other. What did she propose to herself, I should like to know? She had had one husband. She had seen David Copperfield out of the world, who was always running after wax dolls from his cradle. She had got a baby. Oh, there were a pair of babies when she gave birth to this child sitting here, that Friday night, and what more did she want? Mr. Dick secretly shook his head at me, as if he thought there was no getting over this. She couldn't even have a baby like anybody else, said my aunt. Where was this child's sister, Betsy Trotwood? Not forthcoming. Don't tell me. Mr. Dick seemed quite frightened. That little man of a doctor with his head on one side, said my aunt, Jellops or whatever his name was, what was he about? All he could do was to say to me, like a robin redbreast, as he is, it's a boy. A boy. Yeah, the imbecility of the whole set of them. The heartiness of the ejaculation startled Mr. Dick exceedingly, and me, too, if I am to tell the truth. And then, as if this was not enough, and she had not stood sufficiently in the light of this child's sister, Betsy Trotwood, said my aunt, she marries a second time, goes and marries a murderer, or a man with a name like it, and stands in this child's light. And the natural consequence is, as anybody but a baby might have foreseen, that he prowls and wanders. He's as like Cain before he was grown up as he can be. Mr. Dick looked hard at me, as if to identify me in this character. And then there's that woman with the pagan name, said my aunt, that Peggotty, she goes and gets married next. Because she has not seen enough of the evil attending such things, she goes and gets married next, as the child relates. I only hope, said my aunt, shaking her head, that her husband is one of those poker husbands who abound in the newspapers, and will beat her well with one. I could not bear to hear my old nurse so decried, and made the subject of such a wish. I told my aunt that indeed she was mistaken. That Peggotty was the best, the truest, the most faithful, most devoted, and most self-denying friend and servant in the world, who had ever loved me dearly, who had ever loved my mother dearly, who had held my mother's dying head upon her arm, on whose face my mother had imprinted her last grateful kiss. And my remembrance of them both, choking me, I broke down as I was trying to say that her home was my home, and that all she had was mine, and that I would have gone to her for shelter, but for her humble station, which made me fear that I might bring some trouble on her. I broke down, I say, as I was trying to say so, and laid my face and my hand upon the table. Well, well, said my aunt, the child is right to stand by those who have stood by him. Janet. Donkeys. I thoroughly believe that, but for those unfortunate donkeys, we should have come to a good understanding. for my aunt had laid her hand on my shoulder, and the impulse was upon me, thus emboldened to embrace her and beseech her protection. But the interruption and the disorder she was thrown into by the struggle outside put an end to all softer ideas for the present, and kept my aunt indignantly declaiming to Mr. Dick about her determination to appeal for redress to the laws of her country, and to bring actions for trespass against the whole donkey proprietorship of Dover until tea time. After tea, we sat at the window, on the lookout, as I imagined, from my aunt's sharp expression of face for more invaders, until dusk, when Janet set candles and a backgammon board on the table and pulled down the blinds. "Now, Mr. Dick," said my aunt, with her grave look and her forefinger up as before, "I am going to ask you another question. Look at this child." "David's son?" said Mr. Dick, with an attentive, puzzled face. "Exactly so," returned my aunt. "What would you do with him now?" "Do with David's son?" said Mr. Dick. "Aye," replied my aunt, "with David's son." "Oh," said Mr. Dick. "Yes. Do with, I should put him to bed." "Janet," cried my aunt, with the same complacent triumph that I had remarked before, "Mr. Dick sets us all right. If the bed is ready, we'll take him up to it." Janet reporting it to be quite ready, I was taken up to it, kindly, but in some sort like a prisoner, my aunt going in front and Janet bringing up the rear. The only circumstance which gave me any new hope was my aunt stopping on the stairs to inquire about a smell of fire that was prevalent there, and Janet's replying that she had been making tinder down in the kitchen of my old shirt. But there were no other clothes in my room than the odd heap of things I wore, and when I was left there with a little taper which my aunt forewarned me would burn exactly 5 minutes, I heard them lock my door on the outside. Turning these things over in my mind, I deemed it possible that my aunt, who could know nothing of me, might suspect I had a habit of running away, and took precautions on that account to have me in safe keeping. The room was a pleasant one at the top of the house, overlooking the sea, on which the moon was shining brilliantly. After I had said my prayers, and the candle had burned out, I remember how I still sat looking at the moonlight on the water, as if I could hope to read my fortune in it, as in a bright book, or to see my mother with her child, coming from heaven, along that shining path, to look upon me as she had looked when I last saw her sweet face. I remember how the solemn feeling with which at length I turned my eyes away yielded to the sensation of gratitude and rest which the sight of the white-curtained bed, and how much more the lying softly down upon it, nestling in the snow-white sheets, inspired. I remember how I thought of all the solitary places under the night sky where I had slept, and how I prayed that I never might be houseless any more, and never might forget the houseless. I remember how I seemed to float, then, down the melancholy glory of that track upon the sea, away into the world of dreams. Chapter 14. My aunt makes up her mind about me. On going down in the morning, I found my aunt musing so profoundly over the breakfast table, with her elbow on the tray, that the contents of the urn had overflowed the teapot and were laying the whole tablecloth under water, when my entrance put her meditations to flight. I felt sure that I had been the subject of her reflections, and was more than ever anxious to know her intentions towards me. Yet I dared not express my anxiety, lest it should give her offense. My eyes, however, not being so much under control as my tongue, were attracted towards my aunt very often during breakfast. I never could look at her for a few moments together, but I found her looking at me, in an odd, thoughtful manner, as if I were an immense way off, instead of being on the other side of the small round table. When she had finished her breakfast, my aunt very deliberately leaned back in her chair, knitted her brows, folded her arms, and contemplated me at her leisure, with such a fixedness of attention that I was quite overpowered by embarrassment. Not having as yet finished my own breakfast, I attempted to hide my confusion by proceeding with it, but my knife tumbled over my fork tripped on my knife, I chipped bits of bacon a surprising height into the air instead of cutting them for my own eating, and choked myself with my tea, which persisted in going the wrong way instead of the right one, until I gave in altogether and sat blushing under my aunt's close scrutiny. "Hello," said my aunt, after a long time. I looked up and met her sharp, bright glance respectfully. "I have written to him," said my aunt. To your father-in-law," said my aunt. "I have sent him a letter that I'll trouble him to attend to, or he and I will fall out. I can tell him. Does he know where I am, Aunt? I inquired, alarmed. I have told him, said my aunt with a nod. Shall I be given up to him? I faltered. I don't know, said my aunt. We shall see. Oh, I can't think what I shall do, I exclaimed, if I have to go back to Mr. Murdstone. I don't know anything about it, said my aunt, shaking her head. I can't say, I am sure. We shall see. My spirits sank under these words, and I became very downcast and heavy of heart. My aunt, without appearing to take much heed of me, put on a coarse apron with a bib, which she took out of the press, washed up the teacups with her own hands, and when everything was washed and set in the tray again, and the cloth folded and put on the top of the whole, rang for Janet to remove it. She next swept up the crumbs with a little broom, putting on a pair of gloves first, until there did not appear to be one microscopic speck left on the carpet. Next dusted and arranged the room, which was dusted and arranged to a hair's breadth already. When all these tasks were performed to her satisfaction, she took off the gloves and apron, folded them up, put them in the particular corner of the press from which they had been taken, brought out her workbox to her own table in the open window, and sat down, with a green fan between her and the light, to work. I wish you'd go upstairs, said my aunt, as she threaded her needle, and give my compliments to Mr. Dick, and I'll be glad to know how he gets on with his memorial. I rose with all alacrity to acquit myself of this commission. I suppose, said my aunt, eyeing me as narrowly as she had eyed the needle and threading it. You think Mr. Dick a short name, eh? I thought it was rather a short name. Yesterday, I confessed. You are not to suppose that he hasn't got a longer name, if he chose to use it, said my aunt with a loftier air. Babelli, Mr. Richard Babelli, that's the gentleman's true name. I was going to suggest, with a modest sense of my youth and the familiarity I had been already guilty of, that I had better give him the full benefit of that name, when my aunt went on to say, but don't you call him by it, whatever you do. He can't bear his name. That's a peculiarity of his. Though I don't know that it's much of a peculiarity, either, for he has been ill-used enough, by some that bear it, to have a mortal antipathy for it, heaven knows. Mr. Dick is his name here, and everywhere else, now, if he ever went anywhere else, which he don't. So take care, child, you don't call him anything but Mr. Dick. I promised to obey, and went upstairs with my message, thinking as I went that if Mr. Dick had been working at his memorial long, at the same rate as I'd seen him working at it, through the open door, when I came down, he was probably getting on very well indeed. I found him still driving at it with a long pen, and his head almost laid upon the paper. He was so intent upon it that I had ample leisure to observe the large paper kite in a corner, the confusion of bundles of manuscript, the number of pens, and above all, the quantity of ink, which he seemed to have in half-gallon jars by the dozen, before he observed my being present. Huh, Phoebus, said Mr. Dick, laying down his pen. How does the world go? I'll tell you what, he added, in a lower tone, I shouldn't wish it to be mentioned, but here he beckoned to me and put his lips close to my ear. It's a mad world. Mad as Bedlam, boy, said Mr. Dick, taking snuff from a round box on the table, and laughing heartily. Without presuming to give my opinion on this question, I deliver my message. Well, said Mr. Dick in answer, my compliments to her, and I believe I have made a start. I think I have made a start, said Mr. Dick, passing his hand among his gray hair, and casting anything but a confident look at his manuscript. You have been to school? Yes, sir, I answered, for a short time. Do you recollect the date? Said Mr. Dick, looking earnestly at me, and taking up his pen to note it down. When King Charles I had his head cut off? I said I believed it happened in the year 1649. Well, returned Mr. Dick, scratching his ear with his pen and looking dubiously at me. So the books say, but I don't see how that can be. Because if it was so long ago, how could the people about him have made that mistake of putting some of the trouble out of his head after it was taken off into mine? I was very much surprised by the inquiry, but could give no information on this point. It's very strange, said Mr. Dick, with a despondent look upon his papers, and with his hand among his hair again, that I never can get that quite right. I never can make that perfectly clear. But no matter, he said cheerfully, and rousing himself. There's time enough. My compliments to Miss Trotwood. I'm getting on very well indeed. I was going away when he directed my attention to the kite. "What do you think of that for a kite?" he said. I answered that it was a beautiful one. I should think it must have been as much as 7 feet high. "I made it. We'll go and fly it, you and I," said Mr. Dick. "Do you see this?" He showed me that it was covered with manuscript, very closely and laboriously written, but so plainly that as I looked along the lines, I thought I saw some allusion to King Charles I's head again in one or two places. "There's plenty of string," said Mr. Dick, "and when it flies high, it takes the facts a long way. That's my manner of diffusing 'em. I don't know where they may come down. It's according to circumstances and the wind and so forth, but I take my chance of that." His face was so very mild and pleasant, and had something so reverent in it, though it was hale and hearty, that I was not sure but that he was having a good-humored jest with me. So I laughed, and he laughed, and we parted the best friends possible. "Well, child," said my aunt when I went downstairs, "and what of Mr. Dick this morning?" I informed her that he sent his compliments, and was getting on very well indeed. "What do you think of him?" said my aunt. I had some shadowy idea of endeavoring to evade the question by replying that I thought him a very nice gentleman, but my aunt was not to be so put off, for she laid her work down in her lap, and said, folding her hands upon it, "Come, your sister Betsy Trotwood would have told me what she thought of anyone directly. Be as like your sister as you can, and speak out. Is Mr. Dick?" I asked because I don't know, Aunt. "Is he at all out of his mind, then?" I stammered, for I felt I was on dangerous ground. "Not a morsel," said my aunt. "Oh, indeed," I observed faintly. "If there is anything in the world," said my aunt, with great decision and force of manner, "that Mr. Dick is not, it's that." I had nothing better to offer than another timid, "Oh, indeed." "He has been called mad," said my aunt. I have a selfish pleasure in saying he has been called mad, or I should not have had the benefit of his society and advice for these last 10 years and upwards. In fact, ever since her sister, Betsy Trotwood, disappointed me. "So long as that," I said. "And nice people they were, who had the audacity to call him mad," pursued my aunt. "Mr. Dick is a sort of distant connection of mine. It doesn't matter how. I needn't enter into that. If it hadn't been for me, his own brother would have shut him up for life. That's all. I am afraid it was hypocritical in me, but seeing that my aunt felt strongly on the subject, I try to look as if I felt strongly too." "A proud fool," said my aunt. "Because his brother was a little eccentric, though he is not half so eccentric as a good many people. He didn't like to have him visible about his house, and sent him away to some private asylum place, though he had been left to his particular care by their deceased father, who thought him almost a natural. And a wise man he must have been to think so. Mad himself, no doubt." Again, as my aunt looked quite convinced, I endeavored to look quite convinced also. "So I stepped in," said my aunt, "and made him an offer. I said, 'Your brother's sane, a great deal more sane than you are, or ever will be, it is to be hoped. Let him have his little income, and come and live with me. I'm not afraid of him. I'm not proud. I am ready to take care of him, and shall not ill-treat him as some people, besides the asylum folks, have done.' After a good deal of squabbling," said my aunt, "I got him, and he has been here ever since. He is the most friendly and amenable creature in existence. And as for advice, but nobody knows what that man's mind is except myself." My aunt smoothed her dress and shook her head, as if she smoothed defiance of the whole world out of the one, and shook it out of the other. "He had a favorite sister," said my aunt, "a good creature, and very kind to him. But she did what they all do, took a husband. And he did what they all do, made her wretched. It had such an effect upon the mind of Mr. Dick, that's not madness, I hope, that, combined with his fear of his brother, and his sense of his unkindness, it threw him into a fever. That was before he came to me, but the recollection of it is oppressive to him even now." "Did he say anything to you about King Charles I, child?" "Yes, aunt." "Ah," said my aunt, rubbing her nose as if she were a little vexed. "That's his allegorical way of expressing it. He connects his illness with great disturbance and agitation, naturally, and that's the figure, or the simile, or whatever it's called, which he chooses to use. And why shouldn't he, if he thinks proper?" I said, "Certainly, aunt. It's not a business-like way of speaking," said my aunt, nor a worldly way. I am aware of that, and that's the reason why I insist upon it, that there shan't be a word about it in his memorial. Is it a memorial about his own history that he is writing, Aunt? Yes, child, said my aunt, rubbing her nose again. He is memorializing the Lord Chancellor, or the Lord somebody or other, one of those people, at all events, who are paid to be memorialized about his affairs. I suppose it will go in one of these days. He hasn't been able to draw it up yet, without introducing that mode of expressing himself, but it don't signify. It keeps him employed. In fact, I found out afterwards that Mr. Dick had been for upwards of 10 years endeavoring to keep King Charles I out of the memorial. But he had been constantly getting into it, and was there now. I say again, said my aunt, nobody knows what that man's mind is except myself, and he's the most amenable and friendly creature in existence. If he likes to fly a kite sometimes, what of that? Franklin used to fly a kite. He was a Quaker, or something of that sort, if I'm not mistaken. And a Quaker flying a kite is a much more ridiculous object than anybody else. If I could have supposed that my aunt had recounted these particulars for my especial behoof, and as a piece of confidence in me, I should have felt very much distinguished, and should have augured favorably from such a mark of her good opinion. But I could hardly help observing that she had launched into them, chiefly because the question was raised in her own mind, and with very little reference to me, though she had addressed herself to me in the absence of anybody else. At the same time, I must say that the generosity of her championship of poor, harmless Mr. Dick not only inspired my young breast with some selfish hope for myself, but warmed it unselfishly towards her. I believe that I began to know that there was something about my aunt, notwithstanding her many eccentricities and odd humors, to be honored and trusted in. Though she was just as sharp that day as on the day before, and was in and out about the donkeys just as often, and was thrown into a tremendous state of indignation when a young man, going by, ogled Janet at a window, which was one of the gravest misdemeanors that could be committed against my aunt's dignity. She seemed to me to command more of my respect, if not less of my fear. The anxiety I underwent, in the interval which necessarily elapsed before a reply could be received to her letter to Mr. Murdstone, was extreme, but I made an endeavor to suppress it, and to be as agreeable as I could in a quiet way, both to my aunt and Mr. Dick. The latter and I would have gone out to fly the great kite, but that I had still no other clothes than the anything but ornamental garments with which I had been decorated on the first day, and which confined me to the house, except for an hour after dark, when my aunt, for my health's sake, paraded me up and down on the cliff outside, before going to bed. At length the reply from Mr. Murdstone came, and my aunt informed me, to my infinite terror, that he was coming to speak to her herself on the next day. On the next day, still bundled up in my curious habiliments, I sat counting the time, flushed and heated by the conflict of sinking hopes and rising fears within me, and waiting to be startled by the sight of the gloomy face, whose non-arrival startled me every minute. My aunt was a little more imperious and stern than usual, but I observed no other token of her preparing herself to receive the visitor so much dreaded by me. She sat at work in the window, and I sat by, with my thoughts running astray on all possible and impossible results of Mr. Murdstone's visit, until pretty late in the afternoon. Our dinner had been indefinitely postponed, but it was growing so late that my aunt had ordered it to be got ready, when she gave a sudden alarm of donkeys, and to my consternation and amazement, I beheld Miss Murdstone, on a side saddle, ride deliberately over the sacred piece of green and stop in front of the house, looking about her. "Go along with you," cried my aunt, shaking her head and her fist at the window. "You have no business there. How dare you trespass? Go along. Oh, you bold-faced thing." My aunt was so exasperated by the coolness with which Miss Murdstone looked about her, that I really believe she was motionless and unable for the moment to dart out according to custom. I seized the opportunity to inform her who it was, and that the gentleman now coming near the offender, for the way up was very steep, and he had dropped behind, was Mr. Murdstone himself. "I don't care who it is," cried my aunt, still shaking her head and gesticulating anything but welcome from the bow window. "I won't be trespassed upon. I won't allow it. Go away. Janet, turn him round. Let him off." And I saw, from behind my aunt, a sort of hurried battle-piece, in which the donkey stood resisting everybody, with all his four legs planted different ways, while Janet tried to pull him round by the bridle. Mr. Murdstone tried to lead him on. Miss Murdstone struck at Janet with a parasol, and several boys, who had come to see the engagement, shouted vigorously. But my aunt, suddenly descrying among them the young malefactor who was the donkey's guardian, and who was one of the most inveterate offenders against her, though hardly in his teens, rushed out to the scene of action, pounced upon him, captured him, dragged him, with his jacket over his head and his heels grinding the ground, into the garden, and, calling upon Janet to fetch the constables and justices that he might be taken, tried, and executed on the spot, held him at bay there. This part of the business, however, did not last long, for the young rascal, being expert at a variety of feints and dodges, of which my aunt had no conception, soon went whooping away, leaving some deep impressions of his nailed boots in the flower beds, and taking his donkey in triumph with him. Miss Murdstone, during the latter portion of the contest, had dismounted and was now waiting with her brother at the bottom of the steps until my aunt should be at leisure to receive them. My aunt, a little ruffled by the combat, marched past them into the house with great dignity and took no notice of their presence until they were announced by Janet. "Shall I go away, Aunt?" I asked, trembling. "No, sir," said my aunt. "Certainly not," with which she pushed me into a corner near her and fenced me in with a chair, as if it were a prison or a bar of justice. This position I continued to occupy during the whole interview, and from it I now saw Mr. and Miss Murdstone enter the room. "Oh," said my aunt, "I was not aware at first to whom I had the pleasure of objecting, but I don't allow anybody to ride over that turf. I make no exceptions. I don't allow anybody to do it." "Your regulation is rather awkward to strangers," said Miss Murdstone. "Is it?" said my aunt. Mr. Murdstone seemed afraid of a renewal of hostilities, and interposing began. "Miss Trotwood, I beg your pardon," observed my aunt with a keen look. "You are the Mr. Murdstone who married the widow of my late nephew, David Copperfield, of Blunderstone Rookery, though why Rookery I don't know." "I am," said Mr. Murdstone. "You'll excuse my saying, sir," returned my aunt, "that I think it would have been a much better and happier thing if you had left that poor child alone." "I so far agree with what Miss Trotwood has remarked," observed Miss Murdstone, bridling, "that I consider our lamented Clara to have been, in all essential respects, a mere child." "It is a comfort to you and me, ma'am," said my aunt, "who are getting on in life, and are not likely to be made unhappy by our personal attractions, that nobody can say the same of us." "No doubt," returned Miss Murdstone, though, I thought, not with a very ready or gracious assent. "And it certainly might have been, as you say, a better and happier thing for my brother if he had never entered into such a marriage. I have always been of that opinion." "I have no doubt you have," said my aunt. "Janet, ringing the bell, my compliments to Mr. Dick, and beg him to come down." Until he came, my aunt sat perfectly upright and stiff, frowning at the wall. When he came, my aunt performed the ceremony of introduction. "Mr. Dick, an old and intimate friend, on whose judgment," said my aunt, with emphasis, as an admonition to Mr. Dick, who was biting his forefinger and looking rather foolish, "I rely." Mr. Dick took his finger out of his mouth on this hint, and stood among the group with a grave and attentive expression of face. My aunt inclined her head to Mr. Murdstone, who went on, "Miss Trotwood, on the receipt of your letter, I considered it an act of greater justice to myself, and perhaps of more respect to you." "Thank you," said my aunt, still eyeing him keenly. "You needn't mind me. To answer it in person, however inconvenient the journey," pursued Mr. Murdstone, "rather than by letter. This unhappy boy who has run away from his friends and his occupation." "And whose appearance," interposed his sister, directing general attention to me in my indefinable costume, "is perfectly scandalous and disgraceful." "Jane Murdstone," said her brother, "have the goodness not to interrupt me. This unhappy boy, Miss Trotwood, has been the occasion of much domestic trouble and uneasiness, both during the lifetime of my late dear wife and since. He has a sullen, rebellious spirit, a violent temper, and an untoward, intractable disposition. Both my sister and myself have endeavored to correct his vices, but ineffectually. And we both have felt, I may say, my sister being fully in my confidence, that it is right you should receive this grave and dispassionate assurance from our lips. It can hardly be necessary for me to confirm anything stated by my brother, said Miss Murdstone, but I beg to observe that of all the boys in the world, I believe this is the worst boy. Strong, said my aunt shortly. But not at all too strong for the facts, returned Miss Murdstone. Ah, said my aunt. Well, sir, I have my own opinions, resumed Mr. Murdstone, whose face darkened more and more, the more he and my aunt observed each other, which they did very narrowly, as to the best mode of bringing him up. They are founded, in part, on my knowledge of him, and in part on my knowledge of my own means and resources. I am responsible for them to myself. I act upon them, and I say no more about them. It is enough that I place this boy under the eye of a friend of my own in a respectable business, that it does not please him, that he runs away from it, makes himself a common vagabond about the country, and comes here in rags to appeal to you, Miss Trotwood. I wish to set before you, honorably, the exact consequences, so far as they are within my knowledge, of your abetting him in this appeal. But about the respectable business first, said my aunt. If he had been your own boy, you would have put him to it, just the same, I suppose. If he had been my brother's own boy, returned Miss Murdstone, striking in, his character, I trust, would have been altogether different. Or if the poor child, his mother, had been alive, he would still have gone into the respectable business, would he? Said my aunt. I believe, said Mr. Murdstone, with an inclination of his head, that Clara would have disputed nothing which myself and my sister Jane Murdstone were agreed was for the best. Miss Murdstone confirmed this with an audible murmur. Umph, said my aunt. Unfortunate baby. Mr. Dick, who had been rattling his money all this time, was rattling it so loudly now that my aunt felt it necessary to check him with a look before saying, The poor child's annuity died with her. Died with her, replied Mr. Murdstone. And there was no settlement of the little property, the house and garden, the what sits named rookery without any rooks in it, upon her boy? It had been left to her unconditionally by her first husband, Mr. Murdstone began, when my aunt caught him up with the greatest irascibility and impatience. Good Lord, man, there's no occasion to say that. Left to her unconditionally. I think I see David Copperfield looking forward to any condition of any sort or kind, though it stared him point blank in the face. Of course, it was left to her unconditionally. But when she married again, when she took that most disastrous step of marrying you, in short, said my aunt, to be plain, did no one put in a word for the boy at that time? My late wife loved her second husband, ma'am, said Mr. Murdstone, and trusted implicitly in him. Your late wife, sir, was a most unworldly, most unhappy, most unfortunate baby, returned my aunt, shaking her head at him. That's what she was. And now, what have you got to say next? Merely this, Miss Trotwood, he returned. I am here to take David back, to take him back unconditionally, to dispose of him as I think proper, and to deal with him as I think right. I am not here to make any promise, or give any pledge to anybody. You may possibly have some idea, Miss Trotwood, of abetting him in his running away and in his complaints to you. Your manner, which I must say does not seem intended to propitiate, induces me to think it possible. Now I must caution you that if you abet him once, you abet him for good and all. If you step in between him and me now, you must step in, Miss Trotwood, forever. I cannot trifle or be trifled with. I am here, for the first and last time, to take him away. Is he ready to go? If he is not, and you tell me he is not, on any pretense, it is indifferent to me what. My doors are shut against him henceforth, and yours, I take it for granted, are open to him. To this address, my aunt had listened with the closest attention, sitting perfectly upright, with her hands folded on one knee, and looking grimly on the speaker. When he had finished, she turned her eyes so as to command Miss Murdstone, without otherwise disturbing her attitude, and said, Well, ma'am, have you got anything to remark? Indeed, Miss Trotwood, said Miss Murdstone, All that I could say has been so well said by my brother, and all that I know to be the fact has been so plainly stated by him, that I have nothing to add except my thanks for your politeness. For your very great politeness, I am sure, said Miss Murdstone, with an irony which no more affected my aunt than it discomposed the cannon I had slept by at Chatham. And what does the boy say? Said my aunt. Are you ready to go, David? I answered no, and entreated her not to let me go. I said that neither Mr. nor Miss Murdstone had ever liked me, or had ever been kind to me, that they had made my mamma, who always loved me dearly, unhappy about me, and that I knew it well, and that Peggotty knew it. I said that I had been more miserable than I thought anybody could believe, who only knew how young I was. And I begged and prayed my aunt. I forget in what terms now, but I remember that they affected me very much then, to befriend and protect me for my father's sake. Mr. Dick, said my aunt, what shall I do with this child? Mr. Dick considered, hesitated, brightened, and rejoined, have him measured for a suit of clothes directly. Mr. Dick, said my aunt triumphantly, give me your hand, for your common sense is invaluable. Having shaken it with great cordiality, she pulled me towards her and said to Mr. Murdstone, you can go when you like. I'll take my chance with the boy. If he's all you say he is, at least I can do as much for him then as you have done. But I don't believe a word of it. Miss Trotwood, rejoined Mr. Murdstone, shrugging his shoulders as he rose, if you were a gentleman. Bah, stuff and nonsense, said my aunt. Don't talk to me. How exquisitely polite, exclaimed Miss Murdstone, rising. Overpowering, really. Do you think I don't know, said my aunt, turning a deaf ear to the sister, and continuing to address the brother, and to shake her head at him with infinite expression, what kind of life you must have led that poor, unhappy, misdirected baby? Do you think I don't know what a woeful day it was for the soft little creature when you first came in her way, smirking and making great eyes at her, I'll be bound, as if you couldn't say bo to a goose? I never heard anything so elegant, said Miss Murdstone. Do you think I can't understand you as well as if I had seen you, pursued my aunt, now that I do see and hear you, which, I tell you candidly, is anything but a pleasure to me? Oh yes, bless us, who's so smooth and silky as Mr. Murdstone at first. The poor, benighted innocent had never seen such a man. He was made of sweetness. He worshipped her. He doted on her boy, tenderly doted on him. He was to be another father to him, and they were all to live together in a garden of roses, weren't they? Ugh, get along with you, do, said my aunt. I never heard anything like this person in my life, exclaimed Miss Murdstone. And when you had made sure of the poor little fool, said my aunt, God forgive me that I should call her so, and she gone where you won't go in a hurry, because you had not done wrong enough to her and hers. You must begin to train her, must you? Begin to break her, like a poor, caged bird, and wear her deluded life away, in teaching her to sing your notes. This is either insanity or intoxication, said Miss Murdstone, in a perfect agony at not being able to turn the current of my aunt's address towards herself. And my suspicion is that it's intoxication. Miss Betsy, without taking the least notice of the interruption, continued to address herself to Mr. Murdstone as if there had been no such thing. Mr. Murdstone, she said, shaking her finger at him, you were a tyrant to the simple baby, and you broke her heart. She was a loving baby. I know that. I knew it years before you ever saw her, and through the best part of her weakness you gave her the wounds she died of. There is the truth for your comfort, however you like it, and you and your instruments may make the most of it. Allow me to inquire, Miss Trotwood, interposed Miss Murdstone, whom you are pleased to call, in a choice of words in which I am not experienced, my brother's instruments? It was clear enough, as I have told you, years before you ever saw her, and why, in the mysterious dispensations of Providence, you ever did see her, is more than humanity can comprehend. It was clear enough that the poor soft little thing would marry somebody at some time or other, but I did hope it wouldn't have been as bad as it has turned out. That was the time, Mr. Murdstone, when she gave birth to her boy here, said my aunt. To the poor child you sometimes tormented her through afterwards, which is a disagreeable remembrance and makes the sight of him odious now. Aye, you needn't wince, said my aunt. I know it's true without that. He had stood by the door, All this while observant of her with a smile upon his face, though his black eyebrows were heavily contracted. I remarked now that, though the smile was on his face still, his color had gone in a moment, and he seemed to breathe as if he had been running. "Good day, sir," said my aunt, "and goodbye." "Good day to you, too, ma'am," said my aunt, turning suddenly upon his sister. "Let me see you ride a donkey over my green again, and, as sure as you have a head upon your shoulders, I'll knock your bonnet off and tread upon it." It would require a painter, and no common painter too, to depict my aunt's face as she delivered herself of this very unexpected sentiment, and Miss Murdstone's face as she heard it. But the manner of the speech, no less than the matter, was so fiery that Miss Murdstone, without a word in answer, discreetly put her arm through her brother's and walked haughtily out of the cottage, my aunt remaining in the window looking after them, prepared, I have no doubt, in case of the donkey's reappearance, to carry her threat into instant execution. No attempt at defiance being made, however, her face gradually relaxed and became so pleasant that I was emboldened to kiss and thank her, which I did with great heartiness, and with both my arms clasped round her neck. I then shook hands with Mr. Dick, who shook hands with me a great many times, and hailed this happy close of the proceedings with repeated bursts of laughter. "You'll consider yourself guardian, jointly with me, of this child, Mr. Dick," said my aunt. "I shall be delighted," said Mr. Dick, "to be the guardian of David's son." "Very good," returned my aunt. "That's settled. I have been thinking, do you know, Mr. Dick, that I might call him Trotwood?" "Certainly, certainly. Call him Trotwood, certainly," said Mr. Dick. "David's son's Trotwood." "Trotwood Copperfield, you mean?" returned my aunt. "Yes, to be sure. Yes. Trotwood Copperfield," said Mr. Dick, a little abashed. My aunt took so kindly to the notion that some ready-made clothes, which were purchased for me that afternoon, were marked Trotwood Copperfield, in her own handwriting and in indelible marking ink before I put them on, and it was settled that all the other clothes which were ordered to be made for me, a complete outfit was bespoke that afternoon, should be marked in the same way. Thus I began my new life, in a new name, and with everything new about me. Now that the state of doubt was over, I felt, for many days, like one in a dream. I never thought that I had a curious couple of guardians, in my aunt and Mr. Dick. I never thought of anything about myself, distinctly. The two things clearest in my mind were that a remoteness had come upon the old Blunderstone life, which seemed to lie in the haze of an immeasurable distance, and that a curtain had forever fallen on my life at Murdstone and Grimby's. No one has ever raised that curtain since. I have lifted it for a moment, even in this narrative, with a reluctant hand, and dropped it gladly. The remembrance of that life is fraught with so much pain to me, with so much mental suffering and want of hope, that I have never had the courage even to examine how long I was doomed to lead it. Whether it lasted for a year, or more, or less, I do not know. I only know that it was, and ceased to be, and that I have written, and there I leave it. Chapter 15. I make another beginning. Mr. Dick and I soon became the best of friends, and very often, when his day's work was done, went out together to fly the great kite. Every day of his life he had a long sitting at the memorial, which never made the least progress, however hard he labored, for King Charles I always strayed into it, sooner or later, and then it was thrown aside, and another one begun. The patience and hope with which he bore these perpetual disappointments, the mild perception he had that there was something wrong about King Charles I, the feeble efforts he made to keep him out, and the certainty with which he came in and tumbled the memorial out of all shape, made a deep impression on me. What Mr. Dick supposed would come of the memorial, if it were completed, where he thought it was to go, or what he thought it was to do, he knew no more than anybody else, I believe. Nor was it at all necessary that he should trouble himself with such questions, for if anything were certain under the sun, it was certain that the memorial never would be finished. It was quite an affecting sight. I used to think to see him with the kite when it was up a great height in the air. What he had told me, in his room, about his belief in its disseminating the statements pasted on it, which were nothing but old leaves of abortive memorials, might have been a fancy with him sometimes, but not when he was out looking up at the kite in the sky and feeling it pull and tug at his hand. He never looked so serene as he did then. I used to fancy, as I sat by him of an evening on a green slope and saw him watch the kite high in the quiet air, that it lifted his mind out of its confusion and bore it, such was my boyish thought, into the skies. As he wound the string in, and it came lower and lower down out of the beautiful light, until it fluttered to the ground and lay there like a dead thing, he seemed to wake gradually out of a dream. And I remember to have seen him take it up and look about him in a lost way, as if they had both come down together, so that I pitied him with all my heart. While I advanced in friendship and intimacy with Mr. Dick, I did not go backward in the favor of his staunch friend, my aunt. She took so kindly to me that, in the course of a few weeks, she shortened my adopted name of Trotwood into Trot, and even encouraged me to hope that if I went on as I had begun, I might take equal rank in her affections with my sister Betsy Trotwood. "Trot," said my aunt one evening, when the backgammon board was placed, as usual, for herself and Mr. Dick, "we must not forget your education." This was my only subject of anxiety, and I felt quite delighted by her referring to it. "Should you like to go to school at Canterbury?" said my aunt. I replied that I should like it very much, as it was so near her. "Good," said my aunt. "Should you like to go tomorrow?" Being already no stranger to the general rapidity of my aunt's evolutions, I was not surprised by the suddenness of the proposal, and said, "Yes." "Good," said my aunt again. "Janet, hire the gray pony and chaise tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and pack up Master Trotwood's clothes tonight." I was greatly elated by these orders, but my heart smote me for my selfishness when I witnessed their effect on Mr. Dick, who was so low-spirited at the prospect of our separation, and played so ill in consequence, that my aunt, after giving him several admonitory raps on the knuckles with her dice-box, shut up the board and declined to play with him any more. But, on hearing from my aunt that I should sometimes come over on Saturday, and that he could sometimes come and see me on a Wednesday, he revived and vowed to make another kite for those occasions, of proportions greatly surpassing the present one. In the morning he was downhearted again, and would have sustained himself by giving me all the money he had in his possession, gold and silver too, if my aunt had not interposed, and limited the gift to 5 shillings, which, at his earnest petition, were afterwards increased to 10. We parted at the garden gate in a most affectionate manner, and Mr. Dick did not go into the house until my aunt had driven me out of sight of it. My aunt, who was perfectly indifferent to public opinion, drove the gray pony through Dover in a masterly manner, sitting high and stiff like a state coachman, keeping a steady eye upon him wherever he went, and making a point of not letting him have his own way in any respect. When we came into the country road, she permitted him to relax a little, however, and looking at me down in a valley of cushion by her side, asked me whether I was happy. "Very happy indeed. Thank you, aunt," I said. She was much gratified, and both her hands being occupied, patted me on the head with her whip. "Is it a large school, aunt?" I asked. "Why, I don't know," said my aunt. "We are going to Mr. Wickfield's first." "Does he keep a school?" I asked. "No, Trot," said my aunt. "He keeps an office." I asked for no more information about Mr. Wickfield, as she offered none, and we conversed on other subjects until we came to Canterbury, where, as it was market day, my aunt had a great opportunity of insinuating the gray pony among carts, baskets, vegetables, and huckster's goods. The hairbreadth turns and twists we made drew down upon us a variety of speeches from the people standing about, which were not always complimentary, but my aunt drove on with perfect indifference, and I dare say would have taken her own way with as much coolness through an enemy's country. At length we stopped before a very old house bulging out over the road, a house with long, low lattice windows bulging out still farther, and beams with carved heads on the ends bulging out too, so that I fancied the whole house was leaning forward, trying to see who was passing on the narrow pavement below. It was quite spotless in its cleanliness. The old-fashioned brass knocker on the low arched door, ornamented with carved garlands of fruit and flowers, twinkled like a star. The 2 stone steps descending to the door were as white as if they had been covered with fair linen, and all the angles and corners, and carvings and moldings, and quaint little panes of glass, and quaint little windows, though as old as the hills, were as pure as any snow that ever fell upon the hills. When the pony chaise stopped at the door, and my eyes were intent upon the house, I saw a cadaverous face appear at a small window on the ground floor, in a little round tower that formed one side of the house, and quickly disappear. The low arched door then opened, and the face came out. It was quite as cadaverous as it had looked in the window, though in the grain of it there was that tinge of red which is sometimes to be observed in the skins of red-haired people. It belonged to a red-haired person, a youth of 15, as I take it now, but looking much older, whose hair was cropped as close as the closest stubble, who had hardly any eyebrows, and no eyelashes, and eyes of a red-brown, so unsheltered and unshaded that I remember wondering how he went to sleep. He was high-shouldered and bony, dressed in decent black, with a white wisp of neckcloth, buttoned up to the throat, and had a long, lank skeleton hand, which particularly attracted my attention, as he stood at the pony's head, rubbing his chin with it, and looking up at us in the chaise. "Is Mr. Wickfield at home, Uriah Heep?" said my aunt. "Mr. Wickfield's at home, ma'am," said Uriah Heep, "if you'll please to walk in there," pointing with his long hand to the room he meant. We got out, and leaving him to hold the pony, went into a long, low parlor looking towards the street, from the window of which I caught a glimpse, as I went in, of Uriah Heep breathing into the pony's nostrils and immediately covering them with his hand, as if he were putting some spell upon him. Opposite to the tall old chimney-piece were two portraits, one of a gentleman with gray hair, though not by any means an old man, and black eyebrows, who was looking over some papers tied together with red tape. The other, of a lady, with a very placid and sweet expression of face, who was looking at me. I believe I was turning about in search of Uriah's picture, when, a door at the farther end of the room opening, a gentleman entered, at sight of whom I turned to the first-mentioned portrait again to make quite sure that it had not come out of its frame. But it was stationary, and, as the gentleman advanced into the light, I saw that he was some years older than when he had had his picture painted. "Miss Betsy Trotwood," said the gentleman, "pray walk in. I was engaged for a moment, but you'll excuse my being busy. You know my motive. I have but one in life." Miss Betsy thanked him, and we went into his room, which was furnished as an office, with books, papers, tin boxes, and so forth. It looked into a garden, and had an iron safe let into the wall, so immediately over the mantel shelf that I wondered, as I sat down, how the sweeps got round it when they swept the chimney. "Well, Miss Trotwood," said Mr. Wickfield, for I soon found that it was he, and that he was a lawyer and steward of the estates of a rich gentleman of the county. "What wind blows you here? Not no wind, I hope." "No," replied my aunt. "I have not come for any law." "That's right, ma'am," said Mr. Wickfield. "You had better come for anything else." His hair was quite white now, though his eyebrows were still black. He had a very agreeable face, and, I thought, was handsome. There was a certain richness in his complexion, which I had been long accustomed, under Peggotty's tuition, to connect with port wine, and I fancied it was in his voice too, and referred his growing corpulency to the same cause. He was very cleanly dressed, in a blue coat, striped waistcoat, and nankeen trousers, and his fine frilled shirt and cambric neckcloth looked unusually soft and white, reminding my strolling fancy, I call to mind, of the plumage on the breast of a swan. "This is my nephew," said my aunt. "Wasn't aware you had one, Miss Trotwood," said Mr. Wickfield. "My grandnephew, that is to say," observed my aunt. "Wasn't aware you had a grandnephew. I give you my word," said Mr. Wickfield. "I have adopted him," said my aunt, with a wave of her hand, importing that his knowledge and his ignorance were all one to her, "and I have brought him here to put to a school where he may be thoroughly well taught and well treated. Now tell me where that school is and what it is and all about it." "Before I can advise you properly," said Mr. Wickfield, "the old question, you know, what's your motive in this?" "Deuce take the man," exclaimed my aunt, "always fishing for motives when they're on the surface. Why, to make the child happy and useful." "It must be a mixed motive, I think," said Mr. Wickfield, shaking his head and smiling incredulously. "A mixed fiddlestick," returned my aunt. "You claim to have one plain motive in all you do yourself. You don't suppose, I hope, that you're the only plain dealer in the world." But I have only one motive in life, Miss Trotwood," he rejoined, smiling. "Other people have dozens, scores, hundreds. I have only one. There's the difference. However, That's beside the question. The best school? Whatever the motive, you want the best. My aunt nodded assent. At the best we have, said Mr. Wickfield, considering, your nephew couldn't board just now. But he could board somewhere else, I suppose, suggested my aunt. Mr. Wickfield thought I could. After a little discussion, he proposed to take my aunt to the school, that she might see it and judge for herself. Also, to take her, with the same object, to 2 or 3 houses where he thought I could be boarded. My aunt embracing the proposal, we were all 3 going out together when he stopped and said, our little friend here might have some motive, perhaps, for objecting to the arrangements. I think we had better leave him behind. My aunt seemed disposed to contest the point, but to facilitate matters I said I would gladly remain behind, if they pleased, and returned into Mr. Wickfield's office, where I sat down again, in the chair I had first occupied, to await their return. It so happened that this chair was opposite a narrow passage, which ended in the little circular room where I had seen Uriah Heep's pale face looking out of the window. Uriah, having taken the pony to a neighboring stable, was at work at a desk in this room, which had a brass frame on the top to hang paper upon, and on which the writing he was making a copy of was then hanging. Though his face was towards me, I thought for some time, the writing being between us, that he could not see me, but looking that way more attentively, it made me uncomfortable to observe that every now and then his sleepless eyes would come below the writing like 2 red suns and stealthily stare at me, for I dare say a whole minute at a time, during which his pen went, or pretended to go, as cleverly as ever. I made several attempts to get out of their way, such as standing on a chair to look at a map on the other side of the room and poring over the columns of Kentish newspaper, but they always attracted me back again, and whenever I looked towards those 2 red suns, I was sure to find them, either just rising or just setting. At length, much to my relief, my aunt and Mr. Wickfield came back, after a pretty long absence. They were not so successful as I could have wished, for though the advantages of the school were undeniable, my aunt had not approved of any of the boarding houses proposed for me. It's very unfortunate, said my aunt. I don't know what to do, Trot. It does happen unfortunately, said Mr. Wickfield. But I'll tell you what you can do, Miss Trotwood. What's that? Inquired my aunt. Leave her nephew here, for the present. He's a quiet fellow. He won't disturb me at all. It's a capital house for study. As quiet as a monastery, and almost as roomy. Leave him here. My aunt evidently liked the offer, though she was delicate of accepting it. So did I. Come, Miss Trotwood, said Mr. Wickfield. This is the way out of the difficulty. It's only a temporary arrangement, you know. If it don't act well, or don't quite accord with our mutual convenience, he can easily go to the right about. There will be time to find some better place for him in the meanwhile. You had better determine to leave him here for the present. I'm very much obliged to you, said my aunt. And so is he, I see, but come. I know what you mean, cried Mr. Wickfield. You shall not be oppressed by the receipt of favors, Miss Trotwood. You may pay for him, if you like. We won't be hard about terms, but you shall pay if you will. On that understanding, said my aunt, though it doesn't lessen the real obligation, I shall be very glad to leave him. Then come and see my little housekeeper, said Mr. Wickfield. We accordingly went up a wonderful old staircase, with a balustrade so broad that we might have gone up that almost as easily, and into a shady old drawing-room, lighted by some 3 or 4 of the quaint windows I had looked up at from the street, which had old oak seats in them that seemed to have come of the same trees as the shining oak floor and the great beams in the ceiling. It was a prettily furnished room, with a piano and some lively furniture in red and green, and some flowers. It seemed to be all old nooks and corners, and in every nook and corner there was some queer little table or cupboard or bookcase or seat or something or other that made me think there was not such another good corner in the room, until I looked at the next one and found it equal to it, if not better. On everything there was the same air of retirement and cleanliness that marked the house outside. Mr. Wickfield tapped at a door in a corner of the paneled wall, and a girl of about my own age came quickly out and kissed him. On her face, I saw immediately the placid and sweet expression of the lady whose picture had looked at me downstairs. It seemed to my imagination as if the portrait had grown womanly, and the original remained a child. Although her face was quite bright and happy, There was a tranquility about it, and about her, a quiet, good, calm spirit that I never have forgotten, that I shall never forget. This was his little housekeeper, his daughter Agnes, Mr. Wickfield said. When I heard how he said it and saw how he held her hand, I guessed what the one motive of his life was. She had a little basket trifle hanging at her side, with keys in it, and she looked as staid and as discreet a housekeeper as the old house could have. She listened to her father as he told her about me, with a pleasant face, and when he had concluded, proposed to my aunt that we should go upstairs and see my room. We all went together, she before us, and a glorious old room it was, with more oak beams and diamond panes, and a broad balustrade going all the way up to it. I cannot call to mind where or when, in my childhood, I had seen a stained glass window in a church, nor do I recollect its subject. But I know that when I saw her turn round, in the grave light of the old staircase, and wait for us, above, I thought of that window, and I associated something of its tranquil brightness with Agnes Wickfield ever afterwards. My aunt was as happy as I was in the arrangement made for me, and we went down to the drawing-room again, well pleased and gratified, as she would not hear of staying to dinner, lest she should by any chance fail to arrive at home with the gray pony before dark, and as I apprehend, Mr. Wickfield knew her too well to argue any point with her. Some lunch was provided for her there, and Agnes went back to her governess, and Mr. Wickfield to his office. So we were left to take leave of one another without any restraint. She told me that everything would be arranged for me by Mr. Wickfield, and that I should want for nothing, and gave me the kindest words and the best advice. "Trot," said my aunt in conclusion, "be a credit to yourself, to me, and Mr. Dick, and heaven be with you." I was greatly overcome, and could only thank her again and again, and send my love to Mr. Dick. "Never," said my aunt, "be mean in anything. Never be false. Never be cruel. Avoid those 3 vices, Trot, and I can always be hopeful of you." I promised, as well as I could, that I would not abuse her kindness or forget her admonition. "The pony's at the door," said my aunt, "and I am off. Stay here." With these words she embraced me hastily and went out of the room, shutting the door after her. At first I was startled by so abrupt a departure, and almost feared I had displeased her. But when I looked into the street and saw how dejectedly she got into the chaise and drove away without looking up, I understood her better and did not do her that injustice. By 5 o'clock, which was Mr. Wickfield's dinner hour, I had mustered up my spirits again and was ready for my knife and fork. The cloth was only laid for us two, but Agnes was waiting in the drawing-room before dinner, went down with her father, and sat opposite to him at table. I doubted whether he could have dined without her. We did not stay there, after dinner, but came upstairs into the drawing-room again, in one snug corner of which Agnes set glasses for her father and a decanter of port wine. I thought he would have missed its usual flavor if it had been put there for him by any other hands. There he sat, taking his wine, and taking a good deal of it, for 2 hours, while Agnes played on the piano, worked, and talked to him and me. He was, for the most part, gay and cheerful with us, but sometimes his eyes rested on her, and he fell into a brooding state and was silent. She always observed this quickly, I thought, and always roused him with a question or caress. Then he came out of his meditation and drank more wine. Agnes made the tea and presided over it, and the time passed away after it, as after dinner, until she went to bed, when her father took her in his arms and kissed her, and, she being gone, ordered candles in his office. Then I went to bed too. But in the course of the evening I had rambled down to the door, and a little way along the street, that I might have another peep at the old houses and the gray cathedral, and might think of my coming through that old city on my journey, and of my passing the very house I lived in, without knowing it. As I came back, I saw Uriah Heep shutting up the office, and, feeling friendly towards everybody, went in and spoke to him, and at parting gave him my hand. But oh, what a clammy hand his was, as ghostly to the touch as to the sight. I rubbed mine afterwards to warm it, and T.O. rub his off. It was such an uncomfortable hand that when I went to my room, it was still cold and wet upon my memory. Leaning out of the window, and seeing one of the faces on the beam-ins looking at me sideways. I fancied it was Uriah. Heap got up there somehow and shut him out in a hurry.